Hello, my name is Katie Cardwell, and today I'm going to be presenting on instructional design models. This has been a very interesting project because I've been able to think about ways that I have been teaching, and I've come to learn that in the end there's a bunch of different models that you can use throughout your course, your time as a teacher. So let's get started. All right, what is instructional design model? So basically, it's the thought process of how to make experiences and materials meaningful in a way so that your learner can acquire the knowledge that they need. Think about the 3Ds: design, develop, and deliver. Basically, all the different models that I will be talking about, you'll have to have some sort of some sort of design in your lesson. So you'll be thinking about how you design it based upon your students and the different needs. You'll have to develop that lesson based upon your students and knowing them, and then you'll deliver it to them. Also, deliver can be a way of thinking back to, how are my students going to deliver their knowledge back to me? ADDIE, which stands for analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation. Analysis stands for goals and objectives. So I want you to think about the goals and objectives of your students, think about their environment and their background knowledge. So you need to know your audience before you start to plan. Next, for design, think about your assessments, planning of your lesson, different uses of media, and your subject that you are going to be covering. You need to think about what materials you have that you can start to design your lesson around. Development stands for creating and assembling the content. So I want you to think about, how are you going to develop the content for your learners? Implementation is the procedure for learners in this process. So that's where your learners will start to implement their learning and along with you. Evaluation, this can be both formative and summative. So summative, we know, is at the end of a unit, usually around a test or a quiz. And formative is throughout the lesson. So quick little check-ins, maybe thumbs up, thumbs down. Post-it notes, those are formative assessments that you're using throughout your lesson. Formative and summative evaluation tools are very important for both, because in the end, you want to know throughout your lesson if it could be better. And then summative at the end, you want to think about how you can improve your lesson for the next time. Here is a quick chart. So you can see it is a model that goes around in a circle, and each step is dependent on each other. Next, I'm going to go through the pros and cons of ADDIE. So this is a very well-known instructional design. So it's very commonly used, accepted by many, and it's really good for teachers that are beginning. It's effective. So this is one of the oldest ones that has been around, and it has found to be the foundation for other instructional designs. So ADDIE is a good one. It can be very time and cost easy to measure, so you know what you're getting yourself into while doing it. Again, this is a good one for people who are starting, just to build their way off, because it's very simple and you can go through each step at a time. Some of the cons: it must be followed in order, so there isn't really much time for flexibility within this learning model. It can be time consuming and costly, so in the beginning it can be hard to also understand. Some consider it outdated, but do think about, sometimes things that are old can still be revised as new, and also other models are based upon this one. It can be hard to adapt changes within the model. So sometimes within the model, if you're planning, you can't always go back to reassess. Next, I'm going to go for the backwards design. In this design, it reverses the typical approach. So in the beginning, you want to know what you want your learners to learn, and that's how you're going to design to teach it. You will then assess the objectives, how they were met, and plan to instruct the lesson based on the 2 previous steps. So you want to identify their first outcomes. This meaning you want to know what the end goal will be. Then you will start to think of how you're going to assess it in it. And finally, your last step is to plan the instructional methods. So identify results, determine how you are to get the evidence, and then start your planning. Some of the pros: this is a very student-based center learning model. There's a lot of flexibility in your planning. Since there's only 3 steps, you're able to go back and forth between the 3. It's easy to align with any course standards or state standards because you already know what goals you want to achieve. In this model, it wants you to think like a student. So think about how you would get to that end result. Less time planning and more time instructing. In this model, you're able to not spend as much time planning and just really be the teacher. Students will build the skills and knowledge needed to accomplish their learning goals. Now, I want you to think about the part where I say think like a student, and here we go with our cons. For the backwards design, think like a student. Now, as a teacher, sometimes it's hard to put your mindset into the think like a student. It can be a little bit difficult and confusing at first, but with time, you will start to narrow it down and think about the different goals needed. It can take longer in time with the initial planning phases, and sometimes without the student-centered goal, it's a harder process for some teachers to grasp their mind around. Next is gradual release. So normally teachers carry the load of instructing and designing. This model gives more access to the learner to take on their own task. Put more to the you do at the end. The learner should be able to explain their own development. So when I was an undergrad at Temple, this was one of the main designs I used, the I do, we do, you do, and it's something I find myself still using today. There's a lot of responsibility of the teacher and learner, so they're very dependent on each other. The learner will start off as dependent on the teacher and then eventually go to their independent phase on their own. This should be with time to develop. This is more of a gradual process, kind of think of not a rubber band where it snaps back in, but kind of like a slow putty where they're going to the process on their own. So again, here is the model, the I do, we do, and then you do it on your own. Let's go to the pros and cons of this model. So the gradual release pros. Students will start to develop a mastery of the skill. They'll know the application and not just the how to do it. Student confidence definitely increases with them because you'll see them developing their own skills on their own, and they will have more independent work. This is really good for small groups and individual level instruction. So if you're able to have a lot of small group instruction, this is really great for that. Now keep that in mind for small groups. So for cons, if you're not able to do small groups, this could be a con because this is something you want to be able to observe your students and see where they are developing with the I do, we do method through the gradual release. Assessments are developed first, so sometimes it's hard to think about the assessment model and where you really want your students to achieve. If there's misconceptions, it takes more time to go back and relearn them through the I do method. Attention is definitely needed through this model because if students miss during the I do, we do, then they will have to go back and relearn. The teacher is responsible for identifying weaknesses and misunderstandings in each individual student. So you really need to know your class and your students. But if you know them, then you should be good to go. Let's compare and contrast the different models. So all of them offer development. Students are able to develop through them, and so is the teacher. They all focus on the learner and the different goals that they need by the end of it. They organize methods and process of learning, which means instead of just throwing ideas out there, your thoughts and organizations are all put together. It helps engage the objectives. So knowing what the objective is and how you're going to get there at the end. So ADDIE is considered the most outdated, but most models are built from ADDIE. The end can be hard to know what's at first for the backwards design, but it lets you start to think like a student. And that's always good. When you want to think like a student, you start to know what they want and what they need. For our gradual release, if steps are missed, then it can be hard for students to know, and it can be a little bit flawed. Now, I started to give out some quick awards for our instructional design models. But before we end, I want you to always think about, consider the learner. Consider about your group. Sometimes a lesson that you have at 1 year might change the next due to your students and their backgrounds and their needs. Assessments. Assessment doesn't always have to be a quiz or a test. They can be anecdotal notes, a quick parking lot, using your cards, a Kahoot. Think about your assessments and how they're going to instruct your learning. And also think about your objectives. Objectives for yourself and objectives for your students. All of these models have those three things. For gradual release, I gave this one the award for best for small groups. Backwards design, I gave for best for student-based. And for ADDIE, best for beginners and effective. All right, thank you for watching my presentation. I hope you enjoyed, and I really appreciate you taking the time to watch my presentation. Thank you.